Hello and welcome to another one of the Grid News and Views podcasts from Road Knight Taylor. I'm Pete Aston and I'm joined by Nikki Pillinger and Kyle Murchie to go through some of the recent news and views in all things grid connections. So thank you for joining us. Right, we're going to go to our first topic. So Nikki, I think you wanted to sort of talk to us about something about technical limits and what's going on with that.
Yes, so this is almost more of a view than kind of news. So technical limits has been around for a little while, but we're obviously going through the phases. So the DNOs have, they've released the GSPs that are a little bit kind of easier for them to moderate. So the GSPs with thermal issues. They're now looking at the GSPs with fault level issues and the sort of the more difficult batch, like the infrastructure sites and the sites that need a lot more work doing. Good news is that some projects have really benefited from technical limits, so this is great, and they've been brought forward in terms of their connection date. As ever, the DNOs are doing things slightly differently, some more differently than others. But one of the things that I really think now needs to happen is we've got all this really positive momentum with technical limits and with bringing connection dates back. What we need now is for the DNOs to think, okay, so we've got this is brilliant. We now need to actually allocate resource to these technical limits offers, and we need to really, really start bottoming out how we actually deliver all of these projects. Because, delivery timescales are quite challenging at the moment as they are. Lead times for equipment have gone right up. As an example, I had a circuit breaker the other day that was on a 4-month lead time, now on a 12-month lead time. So really, really getting to grips with how long these projects are actually going to take in delivery and adequately allocating resource within the DNOs and also sort of external contractors to that.
So from your experience, Nikki, with so for those who don't know, Nikki does a lot of work post-acceptance mainly, don't you? Sort of trying to help clients move their projects forward from the acceptance point through to delivery. So in your experience, those customers who are receiving good technical limits offers, are they all wanting to proceed? So the ones that you're dealing with, are they all wanting to proceed, or are there other issues that developers have got that are preventing them from actually moving forward, like planning or other things like that?
I think most of them are looking to proceed. In some instances, the technical limits offers have not actually created that much of an acceleration. So it might be you had a 2028 date, now you have a 2027 date, which often isn't particularly helpful. And sometimes you can actually want a little bit more leeway in a project, especially if there's challenges. If you know there's going to be challenges around delivery, both from sort of an internal and a DNO resource point. I suppose it's also quite difficult for developers because everyone's taking a different view in terms of whether it's worth progressing a site much or not. If you have a 2030 whenever connection date, then you're not going to put an awful lot of effort normally into sort of getting planning or getting land or anything. So whereas some developers have. So it's kind of now this race almost where people, also we have Gate 2 coming in at the end of the year.
Yeah, talk about connections reform.
Yeah, so that's also kind of another race to land rights and planning and everything. People are now thinking, okay, can we actually achieve this? Because this isn't something that we thought we could do initially. So it's figuring out whether it's right for your business and your timescales.
So thanks for that. Picking up on the issue of, you talked about 28, 29 connection dates. So I thought the purpose of technical limits was accelerating connections so that a customer can connect prior to like large scale transmission reinforcements being done. So are you saying the 28, 29 connection dates are the DNO dates that they're getting given for connection, or is the 28, 29 date when technical limits can be removed and they can have a sort of unconstrained connection?
So some of the ones that I've seen are sort of originally they had a 2028 connection date and it's come back to 2027. However, there are a lot of technical limits offers that obviously the DNO has to do quite a lot of work in that area as well. So, in some cases, almost like the DNO work will actually take longer than the transmission work will too. So, you can actually have a 2028 transmission connection date, but the DNO might not actually be done until 2032 or something because they need to rebuild the whole substation.
In those circumstances, technical limits hasn't helped at all.
No, Not really.
So the in terms of technical limits and so it's a question to Kyle and Nikki. And what do you think constitutes a good technical limits offer, or maybe what's a bad one to contrast across?
I mean, from my perspective, I think the concern is once you maybe have a technical limits offer that looks quite good from a contractual perspective in terms of date and what that access might look like in terms of kind of forecasted curtailment, that might be fine. But it's the detail around how that A&M scheme is going to be implemented. So are there already agreements between the DNO and the TO on the timescales that are required?
Yeah.
Because in quite a lot of offers I've seen, it's A&M scheme is the solution with a backup of an intertrip. But the danger is if we get to a point, particularly in the next couple of years for those offers that are relatively soon, if the A&M scheme, if the timescales can't be agreed or the technology isn't available in those locations to facilitate what the TO needs, then the intertrip might become the solution, which is then obviously nowhere near as positive as as an A&M scheme. So I think for me, it's that sort of level of detail.
So like the actual delivery of the A&M scheme itself, potentially problematic. Yeah, and for yourself, what's constituted a good or bad tech limits offer?
So it's quite challenging because, as I said, the DNOs are all doing it in different ways, and there's varying levels of clarity in these offers. So I really recommend people to look at their offers, go through with a very fine tooth comb, and obviously get some advice on what may or may not actually be included in them. One of the things that we've got is obviously where there are things like SGT reinforcement or DNO works. It's all very well having an earlier connection date, but you still have this enormous risk in terms of what your actual cost might be and what might actually need to be done. And that's really not clear in some offers. I've had some that just say, oh, here's an A&M connection, you can connect earlier on an A&M basis without actually any indication of what the works are that need to be done, whether there's any DNO costs or even a date that the constraint ends. Yeah. So that there really does have to be absolute clarity within these connection offers that people are getting for tech limits. Yeah. Otherwise, they can look a lot better and a lot less risky than they are.
And I guess like the headline figure for a good bad curtailment limits technical limits offer is the level of curtailment, isn't it? And I've seen a few tech limits offers where curtailment is very, very high, 80, 90, 100%. Yeah. And so clearly, you cross that off the list as very bad, unless you start digging into it and you go, actually, what assumptions has been used to come up with that 100% curtailment figure? Is that at all realistic, or have they made
I think part of the challenge is some of those methodologies are quite flawed. I suppose the intention was to create a common approach for all the DNOs to take, but in doing so, maybe started off in a flawed starting point. And if you then apply that, as you say, you might be getting 80% curtailment, but actually, is that realistic? And start to delve into it. Or you might receive something that looks more positive, but actually those assumptions haven't taken into account other factors that are actually more problematic in those areas, such as other upstream, upcoming reinforcements, etc., that might have an impact for the initial years. So, definitely doing your own curtailment assessments and digging into that next level to understand, as a minimum, at least what assumptions have been made and whether they're critical or not.
Yeah, and last thing on technical limits, are either of you aware of any schemes that have actually connected yet under technical limits?
There's one. Which
okay. You look doubtful, Nikki.
So the whole point with technical limits, right, was that you were allowing people to connect earlier, and that's all very well. But from someone that has a 2032 connection date, even if they're a 33 kV project, you're not going to be, you're not going to have ordered your kit. You're not going to have appointed an ICP. You're not going to have done about 2 years worth of stuff. There is one project that's connected, but I think there may have been I think it may have been built
Right.
and
So-
then
So maybe tech
wasn't
limits
able
necessarily-
to connect,
Right.
and then it was able
Okay.
to connect under tech limits.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe some sort of dubious. Yeah,
Okay.
it seems very odd to me that a scheme was able to connect under tech limits 3 months after
Yeah.
it was told it could connect early, because you're not.
But
gonna
most
build
tech limit
something at that
schemes-
time.
Most tech limit schemes that are good, from picking up on the points you were saying, still have some way to go before they
Yeah.
connect, like probably well into later on this year or
Yeah,
next
sort of
year.
2-3 year lead times probably from actually
Okay.
being told you have an earlier connection date. Go and do your design, invest in DNO design and ICPs, etc.
Right. Well, we're going to lose Nikki now. Nikki, where are you going now?
Sorry, I've got a call with Ofgem.
Ofgem, yeah.
I've got to go.
That's how the
But
other
I'll
half live,
leave you in the very capable hands of Pete and Kyle.
Right, and go and endure Ofgem, and we will carry on.
We will.
Just
Bill.
Kyle and myself.
Thank you, guys.
See you, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki.
So we're going to pick up on our next topic of conversation now. So that's connections reform. So Kyle, I know you are heavily involved in connections reform, full of it. So do you want to just first of all tell us what you're doing in relation to the connections reform project?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're an observer. We're an observer along with Renewable UK, so we are their alternative effectively, and we're therefore kind of supporting, I suppose, the communication of certain material to the Renewable UK members, but also then looking ahead towards the consultation. Actually, what we're also trying to do is a bit more than that, kind of flagging up with the ESO kind of key points as well as we've gone along. As an observer, you don't actively contribute during the meeting itself, but there is an opportunity to flag aspects offline and effectively look at solutions to the key problems. I would say the challenge when the working groups first started, of which there are two. There's one looking at the new process, and it is a transmission process, but that process will obviously include distribution connected projects that require transmission access or triggering transmission works. And then the other is how is it going to be applied to everyone that's currently contracted. Initially, it was quite a large challenge, and you can imagine the conversation went on various streams before it kind of got pulled together. But certainly in the latter couple of weeks, certainly progress has been made. I'd say some would judge that there are definitely gaps, and there's definitely gaps I can see that maybe will lead to unintended consequences and conflicts of interest that will need to be managed post-implementation.
And so give us some sense of the timeline for how this is going to be implemented.
Yeah, so the intention on the offset is that the working group will come to consultation by the end of this month. So by the end of June, the last week in June, the consultation will be open. The consultation document isn't yet with the working group, but should be soon. So it's going to be quite a quick turnaround. The intention is that consultation will only be open for effectively those 2 weeks.
And so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was the first connections reform consultation run by the ESO was around about this time last year, I think, wasn't it? And that was setting out a variety of options from which the current option that's been discussed that's where that came from, is that right?
That's right. So that was then taken forward, and so that was a consultation done prior to the modifications being raised, and then the modifications were raised on one proposal. I would say that normally in code mods, the proposal is quite tight. It's basically a modification for one or two aspects of the code, whereas this is looking at multiple aspects. It's looking at process changes, aspects that are going to be changed through the modification, but also rely upon a lot of other topics, technical limits, others like DFTC, and that's not just on the distribution side, not to mention allowable changes on the transmission side. So lots of aspects feeding in, and the consultation that coming up will effectively be looking at the proposal, so where the working group have got to, and kind of feeding into the ESO and altering that proposal, getting feedback from any party that wants to submit, and then the turnaround is relatively quick. So by the time we get to the end of August, the modification paper should have been submitted to Ofgem. Decision in November, implementation on the 1st of January.
So I
Left
think
and
you've said to me that you could take multiple parts of what's going on in connections reform, and in the past, in less busy times,
Yeah.
you might have had a whole consultation, a whole modification proposal on elements of what's going through connections reform at the moment. So it's big, isn't it? There's a lot of moving parts with it.
It's huge, and if you looked at this, absolutely, you'd split it. Traditionally, it's been split up into many elements, and each of those would probably take 2, 3, 4 times. I'm thinking of statement of works, for example, which you're involved in. Previously, that took a significant amount of time to go through and be fully kind of ironed out all various aspects. So I think it's expected that what will start in January will likely need further modifications down the line. There'll already be other aspects that feed in that won't necessarily be ready for the 1st of January. So while the process will be set, it is expected that as issues arise, then the ESO are prepared that maybe an urgent code modification to make those edits will be made in due course.
So maybe further code mods to come after the main sort of code mod has been agreed and the process has been set up. And then as part of sort of moving on a little bit into the timeline of when it does get implemented, there are so whilst connections reform kicks off in January next year, there are things that will be happening in like Q4 this year, aren't there, in terms of submitting information around Gate 2. Is that right?
That's right. So the intention going forward, for those that aren't aware, at a transmission level, so if you're looking at transmission connections, then you will have a windowed process. So where at the moment you can submit an application at any time, that won't be the case. Going forward, you'll have, at this moment in time, it's indicated to be a window annually. And prior to that, so Q4 of the year before, so Q4 this year, and into early Q1 of 2025 will be a pre-feasibility phase.
Okay.
And for the first year, looking retrospectively back at all those that are currently contracted, there will be an approach to understand how many of those parties could already meet the new Gate 2.
Yeah, which is still being discussed. But do you want to give us a quick snapshot of what we think might be the Gate 2 criteria? Yeah,
so Gate 2 is effectively, the modification is focusing on land. So it's all about what land has been secured and land options that are in place. So a letter of exclusivity is no longer enough. That would not be enough at this particular stage. To get to Gate 2 and get through Gate 2, you would have to have an option in place. There's a lot of detail on what that option looks like, how long it's valid for, the opportunity to then extend that, etc. But the main points are your option for the land, the red line boundary being much more set. So for distribution connections, that's already been in place for quite some time, but for transmission connections, you traditionally had no real fixed red line boundary. That's being that will be changed, and also setting your red line boundary in line with the energy density tables. So before, you could effectively have a very large red line boundary, which would give you multiple options. That would now be challenged if you were looking to take up the whole of Oxfordshire, for example. That would be challenged because it effectively wouldn't be valid. And similarly, on the flip side as well, of course, if you were looking at building out a 500 megawatt solar farm but didn't have enough land for that, then that would be flagged early on.
So I think the last thing to say on connections reform, two things to say. One is we have another webinar coming up.
Yes.
In July, I think it is, isn't it? So we've already done one webinar on connections reform, which was our most popular webinar ever that we've done. So and we've got an hour and a half webinar, I think, coming up. So an extended one. So that would be good to sort of dive into connections reform a bit deeper then. But the second thing to say is just that I have seen come through some RFIs, requests for information, from the ESO to basically customers out there who've got accepted offers asking for some sort of idea as to whether they have these land rights that Kyle was referring to or not. So the ESO is trying to get a picture of, how many schemes out there might pass Gate 2 or not.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to note is if you don't pass Gate 2, you effectively sit in a Gate 1. That's going to be quite different for maybe a DNO connection compared to a transmission connection. For most DNO connections to maybe get to Gate 2, you're probably already starting off at an advantage maybe, because a lot of those land rights, etc., maybe already been looked at when putting the LOA in place historically, where that wasn't required for transmission. But yeah, certainly for those that are coming onto transmission projects, then understanding the ESO and the DNOs are trying to get a picture of how many can move straight into Gate 2, and if you don't meet those Gate 2 requirements, then you'll effectively sit in what's called Gate 1. As you said, there's a lot of detail around what Gate 1 and Gate 2 are, and I think getting involved in the webinar will probably be the best place for that. But it's just flagging that lots of change, and understanding your portfolio is really key, because you either want to know, can you move forward into Gate 2 quite quickly or not, and what's the pros and cons of both.
I think we've said this before, but this is the biggest change for quite a few decades in terms of connections process and so on. So yeah, we just can't underestimate how significant this could be. We'll leave connections reform there, because we could talk about it all day, literally. But we're not going to do that. So the next topic we're going to talk about is variations to DNO offers following second step offers from National Grid. So the general idea was last year, 2023, the ESO were changing their construction planning assumptions and assumptions around battery modelling and so on. And the idea was to do that they were going to put in this sort of holding period of a step 1 offer for customers that didn't include very much at all, followed by a step 2 offer once they worked out what they were going to do with all their new construction planning assumptions. So I think originally the step 2 offer deadline was end of February, that then got extended out to the end of May. So theoretically now, all step 2 offers should have been issued. So that will include direct transmission customers and DNO project progression offers.
Yeah, and I think the DNO project progression offers is probably the key one, because you as a developer and owning that particular project, you may not have sight of that yet, but it therefore will be coming pretty quickly. And it's then how quickly you're given, because we've seen some that are pretty short turnaround timescales.
Well, we were literally just looking one this morning, which is probably why I've just put it on the list of things to talk about. So the DNO's clearly received a second step offer, so basically a variation to a project progression offer from the initial step 1 offer, and the DNO is now going, right, here's what this now means to you as and your connection, and there was a list of enabling works as long as your arm, as ever with lots of these things. But I think the important thing is you just picked up on it, that customer had 2 weeks to respond?
I think it was 2 weeks or 15 days to respond, which compared to any offer you get nowadays, you would not expect significantly longer. So it's noting that when that comes in and lands, it's not the 90 days you might be used to. It could be pretty short turnaround times.
And some of the variations will be easy. They won't require a lot of thought. Some of them are going to be really significant. Some of them might only change your transmission liabilities, transmission enabling works. Some of them might change your DNO works. I guess we don't really know until we start seeing them all come through.
Yeah, will be in the detail. And as you say, it could be that actually your security is still stay the same. It's all pretty similar, but the date looks worse than it was before. And
in terms of schemes affected, so this could be schemes going back even into 2022, because theoretically, if you're the DNO didn't put a project progression in very quickly after you accepted your offer, that project progression might not have gone in until after the 2-step offer process had kicked off last year.
Mm-hmm.
So we could be talking about schemes that go back to 2022 potentially.
Absolutely.
Maybe even longer with really poor performing DNOs, but let's not talk about that. So I think that's just worth flagging, that you might get these variations coming through from second step offers, and look at them carefully to see what they contain. So talking about transmission enabling works and associated securities and so on, there's been another CUSC mod that's been approved, or last week I think it was.
Yeah.
So did you just want to talk us through that?
Yeah, so I suppose the kind of key thing is there were two modifications being proposed. One was a CUSC mod, the other was a modification to the STC, so effectively between the TOs and the ESO.
What does STC stand for?
So it is System Operator Transmission Owner Code.
So it's not one that developers would no, and it's not one that developers would generally get involved with. Developers normally sort of get involved with CUSC and CUSC mods.
Yeah, so the reason that this one was quite important, or potentially quite important, is biannually the TOs will forecast and provide estimates of what the reinforcement works look like, and that then is used by the ESO to calculate your securities and liabilities. And this was to allow TOs not to pass on, to basically create excludable estimates where they did not have to pass on costs associated with projects that had gained construction approval, in inverted commas. So
that's where a TO has got approval to build a particular reinforcement scheme.
Yeah.
And the idea was, okay, once that's happened, the TO doesn't need to secure those works.
So specifically it was built around circuits. So it was circuits and substation works that facilitated those circuits. So if you're triggering a brand new 400 kV substation, it's not the removal of that 400 kV substation in its entirety, but the bays associated with the circuits coming in and those new extension of those circuits, which quite often are driving significant securities liabilities, those would be the aspects that would have been removed. And only when it gets to a point where Ofgem have, through their mechanisms, it was really built around, I would say the kind of proposal was built around the LOTI approach for large onshore transmission investment, but the approach would be applicable to more modern accelerated schemes.
It would have worked nicely for developers, so that as and when a scheme is approved, the securities and cancellation liabilities would have fallen away. But
that was rejected by the authority. The main reason being the other modification that we mentioned was intended to do, I think there was an overlap. We personally saw them as separate because one focused on works that would include any onshore transmission works, whereas the other focuses on anything that was in the HND, so the holistic network design, and the associated follow-up exercise. So really looking at onshore assets that are associated with offshore.
So basically
projects.
Anything that was in HND or the HND follow-up exercise is now classed as, I don't know, sort of strategic reinforcement works or something like that, and so therefore won't get included with securities.
So there's definitely overlap in certain assets. So if you were looking at maybe connecting, if you're looking at connections on islands, so Shetland, Orkney, etc., then it's removing some of those HVDC and HVAC links that were significant. Particularly as you got closer to your connection, those would be significant liabilities. And the argument is they're happening anyway. They've got construction approval. They're moving forward. If you were to fall away, someone else would obviously fill that place.
So do we know then what's going to happen? So if you happen to have an accepted scheme offer where one of these HND type works is in your offer as an attributable enabling work, how's that going to get removed, or is that unknown?
That's unknown. So the exact process for doing that, I think, importantly to note, with reform coming in as well, then there will have to be a reallocation, because if you go into gate one, if you're moved effectively, your offer has to be moved to gate one because you effectively can't meet gate two yet. Then that's one thing that's a big difference.
Because
you wouldn't have securities.
Have securities
so there will be a whole process around how securities are managed during that first phase, how payments back are made, particularly cash deposits.
Yes.
So the reform working group is discussing that at length, I would say. But between the reform process and then the natural mod process, that will have to be kind of coming out in the wash. But yeah, effectively, you can be in a position where quite quickly some of those fall away. I think importantly, though, if you were in that centre of England in particular area where actually only and away from the coastlines, all those works that maybe could have fallen under the CM 094, that STC mod that we were talking about earlier, wouldn't fall under this mod that's been approved. So
if you're in the middle of the country, you're far less likely to benefit from this than if you're on the periphery, near the coast, and near the HND type works. Yeah.
So as we said before, the authority has read it that these are similar in a way, and both could not be approved.
Yeah.
Probably we had a different assumption. So it's something that will be kind of picked up as well with the initial proposer, just to understand whether that's going to be looked at resolving. So, yeah, unfortunately, from a security liability point of view, it's still in that area of needing a bit of TLC at least, where there's already significant challenges. It's becoming more complicated, and other challenges will be arising through the implementation of reform. So, yeah, our ask is that a bit more focus is put on security liabilities as we move into 2025.
Brilliant. Well, we're nearly drawing to a close. One more point to raise. I talked to Philip earlier, who couldn't be with us on the podcast, but he wanted to just raise the issue around data. So DNOs particularly are providing more and more data, which is great, but Philip's certainly seen some issues around quality of data. So whilst there's a lot of data out there, some of it is dubious, probably needs some more checking and quality assurance type work. There still is lack of transparency around certain things. We certainly look to the DNOs to provide more and more data. And then updates to data do seem to come slowly. So some of the DNOs have like a data updates facility where you can request certain bits of information. They sort of suggest a month's turnaround, and then 2 months later you're still waiting for a turnaround. They're all very busy, but certainly data drives a lot of what we do, doesn't it, in the background? So it's really a plea to the DNOs to do that checking of data, get the quality right, transparency right, provide speedy updates.
So I think just very quickly on that, I think it's also retiring old data sets that are maybe updated at a different frequency, or even just flagging that really quite clearly, because quite often we'll see the same data effectively. It might be, if you look at a particular GSP, what's actually accepted, there's probably 3 or 4 different sources of that information on many DNOs websites now, or on portals, but I can guarantee that 2 might match up, but certainly not all 4 will, and there can be massive variations between them. So just knowing which data set new data sets are coming out, and they're more robust because they're more dynamic and updated live, let's say, then understanding that that's the case, not just for us, but everyone else obviously using them is going to be key.
So it's a busy period. There is a lot going on. And to throw into the mix, we have a general election coming up in 4 weeks as well. And it's very interesting that energy, net zero, even networks is a focus around that debate around the sort of all the electioneering and so on that's going on. So it's a very high profile topic at the moment. With Labour trying to sort of propose that they can introduce a clean energy system by 2030 versus the existing plan of decarbonising by 2035. And are those two the same thing, or are they different? What does clean mean? And lots of different things around that. But nevertheless, I think irrespective of who gets elected, there's still all the same industry changes going to be needed, connections reform and everything that we've just been talking about. So want to say thank you to Kyle and to Nikki, who was here, left a while ago. But yeah, thank you both for joining me on this Grid News and Views podcast. Thank you to the listeners. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to have you, and we really appreciate your support. And we look forward to you joining us next time. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Pete.
goodbye.
Bye now.